So, in this segment, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the early Europeans, one of the first Europeans to come over and explore the different parts of the American continent. One of the earliest Europeans was Leif Eriksson, who was a Viking, not that kind of Viking. He was from Scandinavia, from Norway in particular. His father, Eric the Red, created a colony on what is today Greenland. And so from there, he continued to explore along the North Atlantic and eventually made it across to North America and explored the northern parts of North America. He landed in what is considered the Labrador Peninsula, not that Labrador, that Labrador Peninsula, part of Canada. And they did create a colony, and it was known as Vineland. Now, it wasn't a permanent colony. Eventually, after a few years, Leif Erikson and his men abandoned that settlement, and all trace of that settlement eventually would be lost over time. And so, centuries later, when other Europeans came over to the Americas, they got the credit for discovering this piece of land, even though the Vikings were definitely here a couple of centuries before then. So that leads us to Christopher Columbus. Right? Christopher Columbus was born in Italy. He was trained in Portugal, right? Henry the Navigator's school. So he was trained as a sailor in Portugal. And from there, he was looking for funding for an expedition. He wanted to find a route to India, but instead of sailing east, as all other sailors now, they were now sailing along the coastline of Africa. Christopher Columbus's goal was that he would sail west to find a more direct and what he thought would be quicker route to get to India, right? The thing is that Christopher Columbus really underestimated the size of the world. His theory was not wrong in the sense that if they had sailed west, they probably would have ended up in Asia from the other side. However, he underestimated the size of the world, and he also had no clue that there was a big continent in the middle that would prevent him from being able to go through with that plan. But eventually, he was able to find funding through King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. One of the main ways that Columbus was able to hook them in was for God, gold, and glory, right? Meaning that for God, it would open the door for them to be able to find new converts to Christianity, because Spain was definitely a very religious, they were highly Catholic. So for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, it meant that they were new people that they could send missionaries to be able to convert to Catholicism. Gold, naturally riches that they would be able to discover with this new route, would make them very rich, and that in turn would give them lots of glory, because through richness and through trade would give them a lot of power over the rest of the European nations. So with his funding, Columbus was able to set sail with 3 ships, La Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria. The Niña and Pinta were both caravel ships. The Santa Maria was a flagship, so it was much larger, and supplies for 6 months. Eventually, Columbus will land in one of the islands of what today are the Bahamas that he named San Salvador. From there, Columbus figured that he had reached the Indies, that he thought he had reached India, and that's why today it's very common, right, that we interchange the name for Native Americans as Indians. That's where the term comes from, because of the fact that since he thought he reached India, he referred to the people living there as Indians. The same way that on maps we saw that the Caribbean islands were referred to as the West Indies, because he figured he had made it to the western portion of India. Columbus is going to make 3 voyages in which he explores the islands of Hispaniola, what today would be the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, and the coastlines of Central and South America. Columbus will eventually die believing that he had reached India. So through his life, he really believed that this territory that he landed on and explored was Asia. So Portugal and Spain are now the 2 main countries who are out there gaining territory and land to explore. So there's going to be a disagreement over who owns some of these newfound lands. So they decide to ask Pope Alexander VI to decide how they would divide the world among them. And so the line of demarcation was created by the Pope in 1493 that divided land between Portugal and Spain. However, Portugal argued that most of the lands to the east of the line of demarcation had already been claimed, which didn't leave them much room for claiming new territories. So the next year in 1494, through the Treaty of Tordesillas, the line was actually moved further west, allowing Portugal more territory to claim for themselves. And that's why today, if we take a look at South America, right, we see that most of Central and South America, right, this was part of Spanish territory. That's why they all became Spanish colonies, and these are all Spanish-speaking countries. However, here in this portion of South America, we find Brazil, right, which was a Portuguese colony, and that's why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country today, right, due to the Treaty of Tordesillas and how they divided land amongst themselves. Some other Europeans that came to the Americas early on, Amerigo Vespucci came in 1502, and he sailed along the coast of South America, and he was one of the first Europeans to realize that this area of land was not Asia, and this was actually a new continent. And so the German map maker who was in charge of now creating a map for this new land, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, labeled the new land America. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, in 1513, he was a Spanish explorer who landed on the eastern coast of Panama, and he and his men hiked across Panama to the other coastline and actually became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. Ferdinand Magellan was a Portuguese sailor, but sailed under the name of Spain. He and his crew were determined to be the first to circumnavigate the Earth, right? Meaning that they would sail along around the Earth itself. In 1519, he set sail. But when they reached the islands of the Philippines, there was a battle there, a conflict with some of the people that were there, and actually Magellan ended up dying. But his crew wanted to continue the captain's wish of circumnavigating the world, so they continued to sail along until they were actually able to complete the voyage, and his crew became the first people to circumnavigate the Earth. Now, with Columbus's coming to what becomes the new continent of the Americas, we come to what we call the Columbian Exchange, because now we have this exchange of goods, ideas, diseases, all of these interactions between groups of people who had never interacted before. So from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia, a number of goods were now able to be sent and shipped that they had never seen before, like squash and pumpkins, pineapples, vanilla, tobacco, right? And from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas, we also introduced new things that they had never seen before in the Americas. Things like grains, different types of livestock like sheep and horses, onions, olives, and also, of course, disease, right? The Europeans brought with them a large number of diseases that the Native Americans had never experienced. And that's one of the reasons why so many Native Americans were wiped out, because of these diseases that they had no immunity for. So the Columbian Exchange is definitely very important historically. It definitely changed the way that groups interacted. It changed the face of the earth geographically by introducing these new products that had never been seen before on these different continents. And it also kind of changed the way that groups interacted with one another. Native Americans definitely changed their lifestyles, as a lot of them were wiped out, and many of them becoming slaves to the Europeans. And for the Europeans, it opened the door to new trading and new goods. For the Africans, right, it opened the door to the slave trade as they were sent over to the Americas to work. So definitely the Columbian Exchange became a huge part of changing the way that history kind of continued from here on out.